Okay, everyone. Welcome. My name is Paul Nightingale. I am the Director of Strategy and Operations and Partnerships at the Economic and Social Research Council in the UK. I am also one day a week a Professor of Science Policy at the Science Policy Research Unit. So this meeting is very much a home from home for me. I would like to start off by thanking Elsevier for their fantastic organisation of this award ceremony. And give you a brief introduction to the day and what will be happening over the next couple of hours. Before I start, I should highlight that this session is being recorded. If you do not want to be recorded, please mute your microphone and turn off your video camera. Okay, so we are here to go through the Atlas Award Ceremony, which is giving out an award for a significant piece of academic work. This particular piece of academic work has been published in Research Policy, which is an Elsevier journal that has been a big part of SPRU, the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex, for many years. It was founded by Chris Freeman, who examined my PhD thesis, and one of its main editors was Keith Pavitt, who was my PhD supervisor. And I have been involved in the editorial board of Research Policy for many years. And it is, I think, undeniably the leading international journal in innovation studies, which brings together a large international community, understanding a very broad interdisciplinary body of research around technical change and innovation. It has an ability to combine both empirical work, qualitative work, and theoretical work, and has generated, as the citation counts show, some of the most impactful studies that have been published on innovation. So I'm very pleased that, Research Policy has been the home of this fantastic piece of academic research that we're celebrating today. Excuse me. I'm going to run through the sessions that we're going to have today. So the award ceremony is going to be in two parts. First of all, there's the award ceremony per se, where I will introduce various people to discuss the background to the awards, the importance of the journal, and the importance of the work, and then have the authors discuss what the contribution is and why this study is so important. Then we will have a second part of the session where we will have a short break and then hand over to a round table where we will have a discussion about the relationship between research and societal needs. Now, there has been for probably the majority of the 20th century a view that research, if left on its own, will generate outputs that will address important societal questions. And one of the really important contributions of the paper we're celebrating today is to highlight that that isn't necessarily the case, and that the nature of research, the questions that are asked, the methods that are done, the sociological processes by which research is funded, evaluated, published, have an influence on outcomes. And we need to be conscious of that as funders, as editors, as authors, as academics, and as publishers, to ensure that the research we're doing addresses really, really important social questions. And I think today, I've spent this morning working on a large number of proposals, urgency proposals that have been coming into the UK Research Council around COVID. And you can really see a big effort underway there by the UK and international research communities to make sure that research is done in a format and on questions that are really, really relevant to addressing what is the biggest social, health and economic crisis of certainly my lifetime. Okay, for the second part of the session, we're going to be having a panel discussion on those topics. It's going to be chaired by Professor Andy Sterling, who is my next door neighbour at SPRU. And we will have Joanna Chataway, Jude Fransman, Alexandra Gailey, myself, and Paul Struick. Andy will start the questions and answers, and he will chair that session. I am now going to hand over and ask Jeremy Hall, who is the director of SPRU, to say a few words about the importance of this study of research policy and of this award. So if I hand over to Jeremy.
Thank you very much, Paul. I'd like to begin by welcoming our colleagues from Elsevier and thanking them for creating this award, which is very much appreciated. I've actually worked with Elsevier for almost a decade now. I'm a journal editor with Engineering and Technology Management. So my publisher, Simon Jones, if you're out there, welcome to you especially. As many of you know, Sprue was founded in 1966 by Chris Freeman, a pioneer of what is now called innovation studies. Chris and his colleagues develop research and innovation indicators such as R&D expenditures and patents, calls for accountability, and public research funding. Since then, Sprue scholars have participated in a wide range of innovative projects and concepts. This includes things like Project SAFO, which is a groundbreaking study on industrial innovation. The term National System of Innovation was coined here by Chris Freeman and some of his other colleagues. The concept of lean production was in partnership with MIT. Technology foresight was something that we played a fundamental role in developing, complex products and systems. The Sussex Energy Group, for example, today is one of the largest, most impactful in the world. More recently, we've been doing things like deep transitions for sustainability. And this is just to name a very few of the projects that's been going on here. Today, Sprue continues to be a leading research center for science and technology policy and innovation management. Case in point is the paper that's being presented today, Tommaso and Ismael's paper, which analyzes the relationship between research priorities and societal needs and demands. This paper actually builds on and perhaps even raises the bar on Sprue's core academic traditions of problem-focused, multidisciplinary, empirical, and critically analyzed research of policy relevance. Those are kind of, for me, the key concepts that Sprue has pioneered, developed, and continues to do. And for that reason, I'd just like to say, well done, gentlemen. That's a fantastic continuation of Sprue's core values. Just on a final note, this event was originally organized pre-lockdown, and it's since been reconfigured for these troubling times. I'd therefore like to thank the organizers and participants for agreeing to participate here and pulling this together. And I have to say, especially Aristia, she's been absolutely lovely. If you ever get a chance to talk to her, she'll turn your bad mood into the most wonderful mood you can imagine. It's so nice to have people with such high levels of enthusiasm. So thank you very much. All right, and I believe the next person is it Constantine?
The next person up is Seb Oliver, Professor Oliver.
Okay, forgive me. Thank you.
Hi, thanks very much. Well, I think I'm speaking here on behalf of the university as Deputy Pro Vice Chancellor for Research, and I think the first thing to do is to really congratulate Tommaso and Ismael for this fantastic achievement. You know, it's a real triumph, and so well done to you two. I mean, we've heard about the importance of impact, and I think this really strikes at the heart of what the University of Sussex is about. Right from its inception, it's been about interdisciplinary research and pulling together different disciplines to achieve real impact in the world. And I think Sussex is recognised around the world for their impact, and that's reinforced recently with the Sussex 2025 vision, which really puts research with impact at the core of our business. Paul's absolutely right. That doesn't just happen. You have to think about how you achieve that impact, and it's fantastic to see the work that's being done here to really see how that impact can be achieved most effectively through research, and how you can make sure your research is really going to achieve that impact. Of course, Sprue itself goes back to the inception of the university, and it's fantastic to see that it's been driving that sort of agenda since the inception of the University of Sussex, and continues to do so. What I'm really pleased to see today is not just that that there's an achievement being recognised, but that actually everyone's building on that, and not just having a celebration of that achievement, but looking at how we can use that as a springboard into the next thing. So I hope you have a fantastic day today, and build on these achievements. So thank you all. Thanks for organising it. Thanks for participating, and thanks for Elsevier for the opportunity. So I'll leave you to it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Seb. And now could I ask Constantine Bloom, Professor Bloom, to say a few words on behalf of the business school?
So, well, of course, the business school is very proud to have SPRU there. I mean, the business school is relatively young, and I think it's also a great opportunity really for a business school to be relevant. That's not the case for all schools in the market, I suppose, and that's a very unique setting. That's probably not always enough appreciated, but I think if you look at the intellectual contribution that was generated, but that also inspires people outside of SPRU in the school quite a lot. And that's a very unique setting in these times. I think the title of the research could be not more relevant than these days. That was, of course, not planned unless Tommaso and Ismael already thought about this crisis at that time, which was very unpredictable. But I think the research in the UK in higher education at the moment is to a certain extent a bit at the crossroads. And we will see which role societal needs will really play. So this is not about rice industry at this time, it's about the whole sector. So really relevant. At last, I would like to highlight, well, I think we should also look at on the input side. I mean, it's very, very nice people with great ideas. And I think that's a very unique achievement in SPRU to keep people together that think differently, that challenge assumptions, but that also are very excellent people to work with. And I think there's the output piece, and we will discuss that. But I also wanted to thank Tommaso and Ismael very personally. I mean, of course, it's across SPRU, but you guys will get the award. But I think it's a unique achievement to keep people together to work on things that are really, really important. And I'm grateful that the business school can house SPRU to a certain extent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Bloom. I'll now ask Professor Ed Steinmuller to say a few words about the special issue from which this paper came from and its importance and relevance to the broader body of work that it contributes towards. So, Professor Steinmuller.
Thank you, Paul. So this paper was published in a special issue that arose from the SPRU's 50th anniversary conference, which occurred the 7th through the 9th of September 2016. Of course, that conference was celebrating 50 years after the founding of SPRU in 1966 by Chris Freeman and Jeff Oldham. SPRU was founded, as was noted earlier, on the principle of problem-oriented research and was interdisciplinary from birth. And research policy began at SPRU and published the first issue in 1971. In that issue, the founding editorial of the 4 initial editors described the need for a new journal. Increasing social concern with the short and long-term consequences of scientific research and technical innovation has led to a growing need to relate the private decisions of the individual researcher, laboratory, or firm to a wider social context in which the full social costs and benefits of an innovation may find expression. This embraces both R&D project and program evaluation and decision-making in industry as well as government and universities. This was 1971. Okay, so it was a very forcing, prescient idea about what was needed, and that really sprang in part from Chris Freeman's fascination with the social needs relation to science. And he in turn was very much influenced by a man named John Desmond Bernal, or more commonly known J.D. Bernal, who was in turn very interested in the role of science in society. So on a personal note, when I arrived at Stanford University to begin my graduate studies in 1974, 3 years after the founding of the journal, the university's holding of research policy were relegated to a small library in the biology department, where I had to trek in order to read it. Since then, as Paul has noted, research policy has dramatically expanded its scope and international representation. And has become one of the highest ranked, as Paul noted, social science journal published in the world. I was very pleased to be one of the editors of Sprue. The 50th anniversary conference brought together 550 researchers and policymakers and numerous papers. 18 papers were published from the conference with an introduction by Sprue's former director, Johann Schott, and myself. The 18 papers were divided into 4 themes, and Tommaso and Ismael's paper appears in the National Innovation Systems R&D and Sectoral Studies section. Speaking as the editor who tended Tommaso and Ismael's paper through the peer review process and provided my own editorial input, I am very pleased to be here today to acknowledge the outstanding quality of this paper. Of course, I would also say that most of the other papers published in the journal were also outstanding. And I commend the paper and, of course, the Research Policy Journal as a reference point for theoretical, policy, and empirical studies in the areas of science, technology, and innovation policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ed. I'm now going to hand over to Andrew Plume from Elsevier, who's going to say a few words.
I am indeed. Thank you. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Very well. And I do hope I am sharing the correct screen with you. I hope you're seeing the, not the presenter view, but the presentee view of my slides. Can someone confirm? Thank you very much indeed. Well, thank you for that kind introduction. And it's my very great pleasure today to make this virtual presentation of the October 2019 Atlas Award to Tommaso Ciarli and Ismael Rafols, authors of the winning paper on the relation between research priorities and societal demand, the case of rice, published in Research Policy. The Atlas Award was launched by Elsevier in early 2015 to help recognize and promote the best research with societal impact published in Elsevier journals. We hope that bringing wider attention to this research will go some way to ensuring its successful implementation and significantly impact people's lives around the world. How does it work? Each month, a list of 10 nominated articles published within Elsevier's portfolio of over 2,500 journals are sent to an external advisory board consisting of prominent individuals at non-profit organizations who vote for the article, which in their view is the most important to society. The article that receives the most votes is granted the Atlas Award. Since 2019, nominations each month have been themed around one of the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. We then arrange an interview with the winning paper's corresponding author, and a professional science writer writes an article in layperson's language about the story, which is then posted on the Atlas website. I'll paste a link to that feature on Tommaso and Ismael's article shortly after I finish speaking here today in the Zoom chat box. Finally, we arrange a ceremony to present the award, which is what we are here to attend today. It's more than a little ironic, perhaps, that we come together to celebrate the way in which research can influence policy for the improvement of human lives at the very moment where this has never been more important. Indeed, the very way in which we're interacting today via Zoom brings that into sharp focus. Here you see the current composition of the Atlas Advisory Board, who for the October 2019 award were asked to consider articles relating to SDG number 9, which is directed towards building resilient infrastructure, promoting inclusive and sustainable industrialization, and fostering innovation. I'd like to share with you, if I may, some of the comments received about Tommaso and Ismael's article from this panel. And I quote, "This article highlights why we do research. We do not do it for us as researchers, but to improve the quality of life for our communities. It emphasizes the need to align the research agenda and community needs, taking rice as a case study." Another observed, "Such articles are really important to advocate for more human-centered research that relies on innovative partnership." And yet another noted that it was selected because of its comprehensive and systematic gap analysis between research priorities and societal demands. Another board member found it to be an intriguing intellectual exercise and experiment to observe the connections between research and society. They noted that the authors were at pains to outline the limitations of their research framework and that such limitations are natural, but also that this kind of research is meaningful to reposition science in society and to revalue researchers in the social sciences. Finally, I'd like to make brief mention of why it is that I am so personally delighted to be presenting this award today. My own background is in plant biology, with my PhD in plant molecular biology, and my postdoc spent looking at plant innate immunity to bacterial disease, which causes untold losses in agricultural productivity globally every year. And so the paper is on a topic of personal interest. Since leaving academia to join Elsevier some 15 years ago, I've worked increasingly towards helping develop Elsevier's view on the evaluation of research, and now serve as president of the International Center for the Study of Research, launched by Elsevier last year to make a meaningful difference along 7 major research themes. The first of these is towards strengthening the evidence base around the link between science and society, and the influence that they have on each other in both directions. The 7th theme is around the links between research and sustainability, framed particularly in terms of the UN SDGs. As you may not find surprising given these points, it was only after I had already read Tommaso and Ismael's paper that I was asked to do the honor of presenting this award to them, which I am delighted to do now. Tommaso and Ismael, congratulations on this Atlas Award, which I present to you virtually now. Tommaso, as soon as travel restrictions are eased, I look forward to visiting you, at least at Sussex, to hand this to you in person. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I'm now going to hand over to Tommaso and Ismael to accept the award and give us a brief introduction to it.
I shall start, and then Tommaso will give the actual contents. And let me put, if you will, the human face. Thank you very much for the award. And I would like to share the gratitude of receiving the award from Elsevier to all the Sprue community. As it was said before, the paper builds on the Sprue research tradition of social commitment, of doing research with the values of trying to make the world a better place. And it does so in a spirit of pluralism, building on interdisciplinary work, and particularly in this paper on research evaluation, economics of innovation, democratization of research. And actually, it's for me really, this is the moment where I would get emotional and drop a couple of tears and hug my colleagues at Sprue, because I owe so much to many of the people who are here that really I feel this is a prize, an award to the whole community. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing I wanted to say is that we see this paper as a first step, and we would like to be humble. This is mainly a quantitative study, and actually to try to make this alignment between societal needs and research priorities, we think that so this type of quantitative approach is useful, important, but there are many other phases that need to be developed. More policy analysis, more engagement strategies. So I see this as first step, but there's much more to it. And I pass on to Tommaso, with whom in this spirit of pluralism, I have to confess, this was one of the hardest collaboration in my life. Hi, and big hugs, Tommaso.
Thank you to all. Thanks for the extremely nice words from everybody. It's really emotional. It's really hard to be sitting in a room to receive this award, but not to receive the award, to talk to you all. Instead of touching you all. So I'm obviously delighted to receive this prestigious award with Ismael, particularly because it is awarded on the basis, as Andrew was saying, that research could significantly impact people's life around the world. Now, as with all my research, I'm not sure that is going to be the case. but I hope it is. But I do hope that as Ismael was hinting at, what we highlight here is the possible misalignment between research which is produced and funded and the research which might be needed. So it's really an initial step, just to, as I will say in a moment, just to sort of highlight problems. I'm particularly thankful to all those who contributed to the webinar today. Obviously, Alistair for organizing it, and as Jeremy was saying, for being always so good humor and positive vibes. But on a personal note, I'm particularly happy about the award and about all the people who are here, because actually it happens that everybody who's on the screen, on the camera today, brought me to SPRU one way or the other. Paul and Ismael are most responsible because they hired me on this project. So all the blunt goes to them. Ed is also indirectly responsible because they always ask him advice before making this decision. Maria Savona, who's just next year, is also partly responsible, of course. I think joining SPRU has really somehow changed my way of thinking in many ways of doing research in a good way, of course. Probably reinforced some of the things, some of the crucial ideas I always had about doing interdisciplinary research, breaking boundaries, and particularly going beyond strict dogmas. I'm an economist, so I've always felt a little bit closed by economic discipline dogmas. I don't know if I do it because I find value in interdisciplinarity, or simply because I'm not very good in any particular discipline. But in the end, it's good to get an award for that anyway. I'm also very happy because this is a very small way to give back to those people who trusted in this work, particularly to Ismael, as he just recognized. This has been a tough journey for him. And I don't know if I would have been such a patient and good PI, to be honest, as he has been. Not least, I'm happy because this is based on the trust of this work. There's much more work which is going on. Ismael has been doing a lot of work on these questions. We've been doing more work with Ismael, with Hugo, who I think is also connected here. More colleagues. We've been probably slightly influenced the way in which work we've been doing with Joe Chataway, who's be sitting on later, Fiona Marshall, who I think is also around, colleagues in Greenwich Acts in Nairobi, and the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization, in shaping some research for DFID, and hopefully it will provide some hints to DFID also how to fund research, which may be useful for the global goals, but not only for the global goals, but also for very local needs, as we discussed in the Rice paper. And obviously, it also led to a current project with Andy and Joe and Saurabh on steering research innovation, the global goals, in collaboration with the UNDP. So having said that, I'd like just to give if I have 5 minutes more, Paul, just a quick introduction on the not really on the paper itself. I'll try to share the screen, but on the broad topic, and I hope you can see the correct screen. Yeah. And also as a way of introducing the next session, which is probably the main session today, where we're going to discuss some of the crucial assumptions that we're making in the paper, as somebody in the comments have already noted. So where do we start from? We start from this problem that we noticed, that everybody has noticed, and as Ed was mentioning, has been noticed for a while. The distribution, the advances in science are not particularly well distributed across societies, and we see it also currently with the COVID crisis and how much inequalities it is bringing out. So we do know that science technology contribute to solve problems. It also contribute to create problems that we've seen in history. What the problem is that those contributions, those improvements in well-being or deterioration in well-being, are very unevenly distributed across society, because the problems that are addressed by science do not do not increase well-being or do not deteriorate well-being to the same extent for everybody in the society. So the scientific advance itself is unevenly distributed in society, in particular across the demands that societies may have. So the same thing as we've seen now with the current crisis, people suffer because of many different reasons, but it doesn't mean that the research itself addresses all these reasons, and particularly the reasons of those who have less voice. Now, why this is the case, it has been discussed in many different venues. I'm not going to this. There's many reasons and many hypotheses to be further tested and to be analyzed better in order to improve the way in which we do research, we fund research, we contribute to research, but sort of skip that because this is all literature and very academic. So the questions that we want to ask here with this kind of work and with the line of research that we're trying to moving on is, what is the role of societal needs, which is what we do refer as the demand for science technology. What do people would like to see solved and addressed by science technology in shaping the trajectory of social sciences, and therefore the prioritization of research, investment in research. Now, it should be said that we started this project as a project on trajectories, as Ismael probably remembers. So the effort here is to understand how do science move along as the society demand for different, addressing different problems and contributing to its own problems. So this relation between the demand on the side and the supply on the other side, very simple framework. Then the question is, which we would like to pose on the table, can we actually measure this relation between societal needs and research priorities, and how do we measure it? Ismael mentioned about the need to go to understand this qualitatively, which is correct, but I do also think that we need some statistical evidence about it in order to uncover some of these imbalances, in order to understand where there might be more need and there is less supply. So how do we measure that? And this is what we try to do here. We suggest a method, one particular method, and a theoretical framework, which I won't go into obviously now, but I'm happy to discuss later on, or I mean, most of it is in the paper, to measure this relation between scientific priorities and societal needs. And we applied now to a number of cases. So the paper that have been discussed today, which brought us the award, is the studying the relation between supply and demand in research across on rice across countries, and this is where Andrew was most interested, because it does lead with what agronomists do. But not only agronomists, because lots of this research is also on social sciences, as we show in the paper. Then we moved on to, as I was saying before, studying the relation between research which is mainly externally funded, so funded by foreign organizations, on in low-income countries such as East Africa, in relation to the main problems that those countries may have as measured by Sustainable Development Goals. And currently, we are studying at a global level this alignment between research priorities and the Sustainable Development Goals in the STRINGS project, which I hope most of you already know. Otherwise, we're happy to put the link in the chat. So how do we do that? What is the empirical strategy that we suggest to do that? So we measure, very simple, obviously with lots of assumptions. And this is a sort of our general strategy. We measure the outcome of what happens in a research system, which is a very complex system. There's not only funders. Ourselves, the researchers, have a huge responsibility. Because as Paul from UKRI knows, most of the time we do write a research proposal to satisfy what the funder wants, using very nice terms which address the issue. But then when it comes back to us, when we are awarded the research, then we can make some small changes and actually go back to our main incentives, which is publishing. We have the ref here. So there are the institutional incentives here. There's what leads to our promotion. There are the pressures that policymakers have on the funders. So it's a very complex system. So it's very difficult to analyze it. And this is what needs to be done in many different ways. But so what we take very simply is publications, and we take that as a signal of the revealed priorities. So in the end, after you mix up all these interactions between all these different actors in this very complex system, you do have these publications, which says what actually has been done and what has been prioritized in a long period of time. So then we clustered those outputs in different topics, because these topics is what allow us to say what has been the main focus of the research. This can be in RISE, or it can be globally on with respect to SDG, or it can be in any other topic. So as I said, it's a very general method. So we cluster in topics, and this is just to show you, for example, what makes what did come out for the discussion paper on RISE. You can see very different areas in which research has been focusing for 30 years, which goes from the very social science oriented type of research in how agriculture is done, what Andrew was mainly interested, which is plant nutrition and plant protection with respect to weeds and pests, but then obviously all the genetical type of research and the new type of research, which is the GMOs, transgenics, molecular biology, so on and so forth. But also a huge area of research, which is much more on consumption. This is particularly interesting because it's about nutrition for human beings, about allergies, about the quality of the output. Now, so we cluster into these different topics, and we assign publication to these different topics, and then we assign this publication, for example, to countries, or to organizations, or to SDGs, in order to understand what is going on in a given country, what is the specialization of a given country. And then, given the specialization, we try to understand what might be the demands for that particular science technology. So if we take in terms of rice, what we did here was looking at things such as the rice calories, so the share of calories that in a diet in a given country comes from rice, yields, so the productivity of a rice, how much fertilizer is used, so what is the need to increase the productivity of the rice by increasing the nutrition of the soil, the percentage of undernourished, so what is the problem in terms of hunger in a given country. So we create this map of potential demands which may occur in society, and then we exploit this variation between specialization in different topics and different demands across countries in order to understand what is the relation between the supply and the demand distribution. So we did this in the case of rice, looking at research rice priorities and societal demands for technologies in agriculture. We do find some obvious relation, which one might think. So in countries where you have lower yield, you have more investment in plant nutrition, which makes sense. But then we also find serious needs alignments, as we call them. So you have countries in which you may have more needs for nutrition, where you have more starvation, where more calories come from rice, and you have less or no more research into human consumption. And you seem to find out that most of the research in human consumption is in countries that export rice, that have to meet those standards in order to be able to export to European countries or to the US, but not for the nutrition in their own country. Then we done a similar, so using the same method, but very different, looking at research priorities in East Africa, in Kenya, Rwanda, and Tanzania in relation to the Sustainable Development Goals, and particularly to the available indicators of SDG targets. And there as well, we do find that, for example, those countries perform really poorly in terms of SDG 9, which is industry, infrastructure, innovation. Definitely do not score very well in terms of poverty, in terms of hunger, in terms of clean water and sanitation. They also do not score well in health, which is where most of the research focuses. So you have this strange imbalance between 50% of the research being on health, and health being a serious problem, but not the most serious problem. So why, was the question, why is all this research, which is driven by mainly external funders, such as Wellcome's Trust, NIH, DFID, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, why is it mainly on health, and why other SDGs, which are at least equally important, receive so little attention? It might be because there's more marginal returns in doing research on health. So there might be many reasons. We're not saying this is a huge problem. There shouldn't be research on health, but there are questions here in terms of understanding how this balance works. So just to summarize, the idea here is to explore, provide different methods and procedures to estimate this relation between societal demands and research priorities. Identifying the research priorities by using research output, which would be the sort of outcome of the research system, identifying carefully what might be revealed societal demands, and this is extremely difficult as we have experienced, and I'm happy to have a discussion about that, and then try to exploit variation across organizations, across countries, across industries, in order to understand those relations. Now we need to move ahead. This was very nice. It was a very nice experiment. We need to move ahead. As has been noted, there are many assumptions here, and one particular aspect that we would like to discuss, which we put on the table for a discussion today for the round table, and I'm sure we're going to have a very nice discussion about that, is what do we mean by alignment? When do we expect an alignment between research priorities and societal demand? When do we expect that there is a one-to-one correlation? As I said before, it might be that health is more relevant, there is more returns to research on health than there is on other topics. So why do we want an alignment? Is that an alignment important? What is the role of basic research, for example, which do not account for keywords which are particularly relevant to applied topics, but it can, and it is many times extremely relevant to advanced applied research. How do we know that research that does not address a given topic in a very explicit way, because it does mention it, actually is not contributing to it? How do we understand this contribution to different societal demands, even if the topic is not on that particular topic because of the keywords? And in how many different can we address a societal need, which is not only that particular research? So there's a lot of research done there, and I do hope that more research will be funded in this area in order to understand more in detail why there are this misalignment, whether this misalignment should be corrected. And obviously I'm looking at Paul here, just hinting that some of this research might be extremely useful, but there are better ways of measuring these imbalances. And we need to improve the way, the methods and the instrument and the data with which we're doing that. And part of it we're doing in the Strings project, which I hope most of you will be involved with, because we do need a lot of feedbacks. We're doing this quantitative mapping there as well on a global scale, but we need also experts to give us much more and much better understanding about what we're doing. And we're running a massive Delphi survey in order to gather that more contextual information. So I hope most of you might be involved. And I stop here. And thank you very much again for the award and for listening. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Tommaso and Ismael. That was extremely useful. We're now coming to the end of this part of today. So I'd just like to do a few thanks. So I'd like to thank, obviously, Tommaso and Ismael for that fantastic introduction to their work and the wonderful project that they've been involved in. And as those of you who've been following the comments, you can see there's still creative tension between the authors and disagreement, even as they're presenting for their prize. This work is very, very important, and I think it will become more important. So as science and technology develop and they get more powerful, then their impacts in time and space are going to increase. And the importance of us understanding both the positive and the negative impacts of science and technology, and how they're distributed around society, nationally and internationally, are going to become more important. So, you know, it's really, really vital that as those of us like myself who are trying to influence the direction of technological change, we allow ourselves to be informed by this sort of research. So I'd like to thank a number of people. First of all, I'd like to thank Elsevier. This has been a huge amount of work from Elsevier. This is a fantastic award, and I'm very, very proud to be involved in this. This has been a huge amount of work. 18,000 journals is a lot of journals over an entire year. So I would like to thank the team. I would like to thank, of course, all the reviewers who have done a huge amount of work looking at this. I would like to thank Prada for all her work organising this. I would particularly like to thank the speakers for keeping to time. And I would like to build on Ismael's point that this is a communal effort. Research is not something that happens in isolation. As academics, we draw on work that has been done before, we develop that, we try our best to improve it, and then we pass that improved work on, we hope, improved work, to the next generation. So this is very much a communal activity, and the two awardees here are extremely modest in pushing out that this is something that they have drawn on a big community from, because I think this is an instance where their two contributions really are standout contributions here. I'd like to thank the University of Sussex and the Business School for hosting this, albeit in a virtual way. And I'd really like to thank the Business School at Sussex for being so supportive of this interdisciplinary, problem-orientated work, and for providing some space for critical social science that is both empirically extremely rigorous, but also has a important normative agenda and is not afraid to be critical of organizations that fund research. So as a funder of research, I would like to thank the two authors for keeping us on our toes and for making sure that the way we award resources is aligned with the highest quality research. And again, I'd like to strongly emphasize that ESRC is very supportive of critical social science. So finally, thanking the funders. This work has drawn on a number of projects. So UKRI-SRC has funded some, but also there's been some European work. So funders are very important. My thanks goes out to the people who very rarely get thanked, who are lots of people in funding agencies who do a lot of work. I'm running slightly over time, so I'm going to stop there, and I apologize if there's anyone I've missed. And I'm going to hand over to Andy, who is going to introduce the next session. So thank you very much, everyone, for all your hard work and for a wonderful award ceremony. Andy.
Thank you very much, Paul. I believe that on the agenda we have a 5-minute pause for everybody to grab a coffee, and imagine we're all hugger-mugger around the coffee machine, barging each other to get at the biscuits. So if we could do that, I think, and I stand to be corrected, but for just 5 minutes. So resume at 10:55, and I look forward to introducing the next session. Thanks, everybody. 10:55. So welcome back, everybody. That was a great session earlier, actually quite inspirational, I thought. And I just, first of all, want to kick off by joining with what others have said about the work that we're here to talk about. That not only, though I wanted to add, are we celebrating here two excellent scholars, but just from personally working with both Tommaso and Ismael over the years, these are two of the most fantastic colleagues and all-round people generally that you might want to meet. And I can say that remotely without hopefully embarrassing them too much, but well done, guys. I guess one of the reasons I've been asked, and it's a privilege to be asked to chair this session, which I'm really looking forward to, is that one of the things I've worked on in SPRU over the past 15 years is the ESRC STEP Centre, looking at pathways to sustainability, struggling to try to do this kind of job, illuminating possible pathways in research, innovation, and wider institutions towards sustainability. And this study is just such a wonderful example in the specific field of innovation studies, just showing by doing. In fact, showing by doing could be another addition to the iconography of innovation studies, showing by doing how this is done. And so based on this work, I wanted to, before I introduce our really exciting panel, just make 3 quick points in my 5 minutes about what I think is additional significance of this work we're talking about. First of all, the challenge of doing this properly, as Andrew mentioned from Elsevier earlier on in the first session, it's not just about research speaking truth to power, that's crucial, but it's also about speaking about power in research. And like shadows on the cave wall, this is what Ismael and Tommaso are starting to show, these imprints of how power works in research and innovation. And the second point is, the challenge is very difficult. So much academia is about looking under the lamppost, what established methods show us and show clearly. But it's the challenge of looking at societal needs, research and societal needs that we're going to be discussing in this session is not just about looking under these lampposts, but struggling to cast new light. And again, these pioneering quantitative tools and visualization methods that Tommaso and Ismael use really do give us a fantastic example of that. And then a third, final point just comes out of this for discussion is don't forget diversity in the societal needs themselves, in the context, in the pathways available to meet these, and in the perspectives on them. And we had a wonderful example of that in the chat box with the two awarded authors heckling each other in what we might interpret the results to mean. So that's a fantastic example of the importance of diversity. And this is what the Strings project that Tommaso mentioned is really trying to focus on with the UNDP. So there we are. There's some 3 quick issues, but it's not for me to talk here. It's for me to just simply introduce the questions for our wonderful array of panelists that we have today. First of all, I'll introduce the questions, and then I'll introduce the panelists who have prepared some thoughts for just 5 minutes initially. We'll go through each panelist for 5 minutes each, and then I will endeavor to be watching the chat box and channel questions back, and we'll rotate until our discussion time is done, 5 minutes at the end for the panelists to sum up. So the questions then that we asked our panelists to think about, and they will focus on different aspects as according to their own interests and expertise. First, we asked the panelists, what is your definition of societal needs? We use the term quite lightly, but what does it mean? What is the single most effective way in which research funders can ensure that the research that they support is relevant to addressing these societal needs? Another term is alignment. We asked our panelists, what is your definition of alignment? What does it actually mean between the overall goals of research funders and their contribution to this elusive thing, the public good? And then the third question we asked our panelists to think about is, what is the, just to try and ground this, because it can get quite esoteric, what is the single most important action that a funder should take to prioritize its research in relation to societal needs, the single most important concrete action? So I'm really looking forward to thoughts on these, and no doubt, knowing we're all academics, other things as well. I will introduce our panelists all together now, and then we'll go from one to the other in the sequence that I now go through. So first of all, I'd like to welcome, and it will be actually in a few minutes, so we might come to her at the end actually, but Professor Joanna Chataway. She's Professor and Head of the Department of Science and Technology, Engineering and Public Policy at UCL.
And I'm here, Andy. Oh,
you are here, Joanna. Very, very welcome. So I'll kick off with you if you don't mind. And Jo's research is expressly over many years about linking science and innovation policy instruments and investment to social outcomes. And also, Jo is co-directing the Strings project that Tommaso mentioned earlier with me as well. So then we will come to Dr. Alessandra Gallier, who's a senior gender scientist at the International Livestock Research Institute, ILRI, based in Kenya. And Alessandra's work integrates gender analysis, a crucial illustration of the kind of thing that's not shown by many metrics in relation to livestock value chains, with a particular focus on animal genetics and women's empowerment. So welcome Alessandra as our second speaker. Dr. Jude Fransman is an honorary fellow at the Open University and convener of the Rethinking Research Initiative, again, directly focusing on the issues we're talking about today. And her research focuses on the politics of knowledge for global development. Professor Paul Nightingale, we've heard from, Professor of Strategy at University of Sussex and Director of Special Projects at the ESRC, so very much at the hard end of these matters, as well as being an editor of research policy. And we heard from Paul earlier. I look forward to hearing your thoughts, Paul, in this session. And then our final panelist, Paul Strauch. I hope, Paul, I've pronounced your name correctly. I take that as a positive. Professor of Crop Physiology at Wageningen University. And Paul has carried out research on forage crops, potato physiology, seed production technology, crop ecology, and many other issues. So really much engaged in some of the detail that the present paper has really sought to engage in as well, thinking about exactly these issues. So I really look forward to hearing from this panel. 5 minutes each, please, colleagues. And Professor Joe Chataway, please kick us off.
Very good. And I'm sorry, I feel like I'm gate crashing a party. I'm really sorry not to have been at the celebration earlier. I'm doing a training at Bayes today, so it's a busy day, but great to be here. And I'm just going to address two of the questions. I'm going to just say some words about the definition of alignment, and then, of course, because everyone wants to chip in on what funders should be doing, I'm going to say a few words about that. So on the definition of alignment between research and public good, it's much easier. I think we're learning it's easier to say, to shed light on, to give perspectives on what misalignment looks like than firm statements about what alignment should be and can be. Tommaso and Ismael, in that fantastic paper and in other work they've done, have really informed, I think, our perspectives on how we can begin to unpick what misalignment is, what it looks like. But still, you know, even though it's partly because of that work, it's beginning to be a bit more tractable. You can get your head around it a bit. It's still at broader levels, at meso and macro levels, it's still a challenge to think about misalignment. I think our strings project has been talked about a bit, so I won't go into too much detail. But the Strings project is funded by UKRI and is being conducted in partnership with UNDP, and it's exploring these issues. That's not surprising because Tommaso is playing a leading role in that, and Ismael too is heavily involved. It's exploring some of the work, the themes that Tommaso and Ismael have looked at in their rice work, but at different scales. So a big bibliometrics exercise, which is really trying to generate a macro picture of outputs from research and to enable us to think therefore about these issues of alignment and misalignment. We'll do some work on pattern data at that kind of level too. At the meso level, we're using a Delphi mechanism to begin to capture different views, perspectives and insights from groups of people coming at the issue from different angles. And at a micro level, again, we're doing a number of case studies. Part of the reason it's so difficult to do this stuff is because misalignment and alignment in particular involve consideration of direct and indirect impact, of course, and timeframes, and those complicate the issues. We might come back to that in the discussion perhaps. What should funders be thinking about? We'll all have many opinions about it, but I really do think one very important thing, which of course funders are already thinking about, is how you evaluate the broader impacts of research. Lots of work going on about this at SPRU and elsewhere. And I'm sure because of the lineup of the panel, we'll get some other perspectives on that. In the UK, of course, we have ResearchFish and REF with the impact component built in. The Wellcome Trust and IDRC are all adopting very different evaluation systems to the ones we have conventionally used to look at research, and all of that is helping us, I think, to think about alignment and misalignment issues. But a really difficult thing in all of that is to measure use. Use and adoption and diffusion is, of course, key to understanding impact, which you need to think about alignment and misalignment. And impact's hard and expensive to measure. And the implications of looking at impact are seriously far-ranging in relation to funding. Getting it wrong will involve paying a high price, I think, so the stakes are quite high. So these 2 points come together, I think, and let me try and articulate a final point. It's a kind of a half point because it's not fully thought through, but I'll give it a go anyway. I've talked about strings a bit, and most of what we're doing in strings is about policy for science, how you create good policy to inspire and create wonderful science. And we hope to come out with some useful insights that can guide interventions and investment in science for positive impact. It's likely, though, at some point, we're going to have to recognize that thinking about policy for science only actually gets us so far if we think about it in narrow terms. Because at some point we'll need to think about science for policy, in other words, science advice. In the end, impact depends on how science advisors and innovators draw on and use science that funders have supported, of course. And there's a lot of analysis, much of it coming from SPRU, of course, about the relationship between research and innovation, but much less on research and advice and advisory services. So how those who fund and support science interact with those who use science for policy advice, as well as in relation to innovation, is a really interesting issue, and as COVID-19 has demonstrated, a really vital area. At the moment, science funders mostly engage indirectly via the research they support and via some of the evaluation that they do. But if we want more impact, is there a case for thinking creatively about how other engagement between policy for science and science for policy happens? I'll end there.
Wonderful, Jo. Thank you. That's a great start to get off to. A lot of really rich issues there. And I just want to, as I mentioned at the beginning, to remind colleagues, please do, unlike as in a normal conference, as our speakers, our panelists are talking, feel free to register questions or indeed comments in the chat box. We're all very familiar, I think, now with Zoom after these last few weeks. So please use that chat box at the bottom of the screen to put in your comments as we go, and I'll endeavour to collect those up and kick us off for the question session, which begins when the panelists finish. So, and also please remember to keep your microphone switched off when you're not speaking. So thank you very much, Jo. That was great. We now have Alessandra Gallier for 5 minutes, please.
Hi, good morning, everybody. So I worked on a definition of societal needs, and I defined societal needs as what is needed in terms of resources, policies, institutional arrangements, the innovations, maybe technological or institutional again, to enable current and future generations of women and men, girls and boys, to thrive in their chosen life paths, both as individuals and as a group in the global ecosystem. Now, I've also decided to talk a little bit about the reasoning behind this definition. I work for ILRI, the International Livestock Research Institute, which is part of the CGIAR. You may know the CGIAR. We do agricultural research for development, mostly using public funds. So one of the questions that we often ask ourselves is, okay, who's our research supposed to address, given that we're using public funds? And the CGIAR works mostly with small-scale farmers, and ILRI, because of its focus on livestock, works mostly with the small-scale livestock farmers in the rural areas. But then the next question is, okay, but then which needs of these people do we need to address? And at ILRI, we adopt a very participatory approach. So we really engage with livestock keepers and try and ask them on the ground, what is it that you need? Is it about education, about food security, nutrition security, livelihoods? What is it? I work as a senior gender scientist there. So my job is very much trying to understand what different groups of people need on the ground, and specifically what women and men, girls and boys may need on the ground. So one of the questions I often deal with is who can voice their needs? We know very well that when we go to the ground without a gender sensitive approach, we very often just hear the voices of the group leaders, community leaders, and so on. But then the other question is, okay, who has decision-making power to make their needs heard and addressed? So I can give you a practical example. I often work with genetics projects. We go to communities and we ask them, for example, we try and improve a breed of chickens. We go to the community and ask them, what traits would you like to see in a chicken? Some people will say a lot of eggs. Some other people will say, I want a big chicken because maybe they sell the chicken and they really care about the weight. Some people will say, I want disease resistance, maybe because they are far away from the animal health service providers. Okay, so we make sure that everybody is able to express their opinion, but then the scientist goes back with this list of traits, and they still need to prioritize which ones they want to address in their breeding program, because they can't have a chicken that has all of them. So it's also important that we make sure that the traits that different groups have been able to express also make it in the final prioritization. So that's very important. A third point that I often look at, because I do a lot of work on empowerment, is okay, looking at needs somehow seems to look at the basics, a bit of the survival bits. What about aspirations? What about the change that people want to see in their life for their right to self-determination? So how do we move beyond needs and move into aspirations? So as I said, often in my work, I deal with this issue of creating a space, a platform for everybody to voice their needs across ethnic groups, gender, of course, age, and so on. Who has decision-making power to make their needs heard and addressed? And what about aspirations? But then there is still one question that I find particularly problematic in a way. Is okay, we adopt this bottom-up approach to identify needs and prioritize them. But then how do we combine this bottom-up approach with more maybe longer-term societal needs, or maybe larger scale societal needs, such as gender equality and, for example, environmental sustainability? Or in other words, what happens if gender equity is not on the agenda of the community? And I can give you a practical example. I've just done a study in peri-urban Nairobi with milk traders. We were looking at gender constraints and opportunities of milk traders. And we realized at the end of the study that women and younger men were, because of gender constraints, because biases, limitation, mobility, and a number of other issues, they were less able to benefit from dairy trading as compared to older men traders. So then we came up with our findings. We developed an intervention that was gender responsive to address some of these constraints. And then we brought the findings and intervention back to the community and the policymakers. And they looked at it and they said, well, in fact, gender equity is not exactly our priority. We don't think this is so important. And, we don't think we should have a gender responsive intervention. So now the final question for me is, how do we combine these bottom-up needs and that we may produce with the communities with the more longer-term societal needs? Thank you. Look forward to the discussion.
Wonderful, thank you. So that's great. We've heard from Joe about some of the high-level policy challenges and the new kinds of instruments we need, and from Alessandra there about the challenges at the ground level in addressing these crucial issues of diversity, not least among chickens, but or chicken traits, but in general, and participatory processes. So that's a great start. And now we move to Jude Fransman, where I think we'll focus on the politics of exactly how you ended up, Alessandra, the linkages between these two. So Jude, over to you, please.
Thank you, everybody. Is my mic working? Just to check.
Yes, perfect.
Seems a bit sporadic. Thanks. It's really a pleasure to be here to be celebrating this article, which I revisited this week and is incredibly useful, and also to hear all these contributions. I've been scribbling notes as I go along, and now there's so much that I want to say and so much that has been said, so excuse me if it's not the most coherent contribution. But I just want to start by giving a sense of where I'm coming from, because I think perspective and context is really important in all of this. And so my research, I focus, as Andy said, on the politics of knowledge, but most specifically looking at research funded through Overseas Development Assistance, ODA funded research, and that has its own particular logic. So the purpose of this funding is to support research that has direct benefit to lower and sometimes middle income countries. and in the UK context, it also interacts with the UK's own interpretation of ODA, which is changing and likely to shift further. The other thing that I wanted to say is also that I represent a network of networks, the Rethinking Research Collaborative, and this is a group of academic networks, civil society networks, research capacity providers, international organisations, all committed to rethinking research in light of competing politics. But it is an ideologically motivated and framed network. So we have very strong principles of social, cognitive and environmental justice. And I think one of the things that I want to stress is that within this politics, that there is an infusement of ideologies, whether that's at the level of the research funder or the implementation of research or the translation of research into practice. So just to go through very, very quickly, because a lot of my points have been made by previous speakers, the three questions. I think when we come to a definition of societal needs, really at the heart of this, as Andy mentioned earlier, is this idea of diversity and multiplicity. Who is society? Are we talking about, if we talk about the public good, who are the publics, the different communities that the research is speaking to? And this is multiplicity, not just in terms of whether they cross disciplines or sectors or countries, whether they're community-based organizations, international organizations, frontline health workers and other professionals, governments or funders, media. But also it's a multiplicity of scales. And I think what Alessandra just said now about the challenge of integrating participatory ground level understandings of need and aspirations with these higher level global challenges which are emerging, particularly within the COVID crisis at the moment. So how do you actually understand the different needs emerging at these different scales? How do you understand the competing tensions within them, but also how do you kind of reconcile across these needs? And in terms of advice or suggestions, I don't know if I'm in a position to advise, but for funders, I would propose that a response is based on first of all mapping, continual mapping of these needs, and these needs are, as well as being complex, they are emergent. I think the paper Tommaso and Ismael's paper really focuses on the systemic complexity, both in terms of the very complex interplay of knowledge actors within a system, but also the emergent nature. So when we think about mapping, this has to be an ongoing mapping. Needs are turning into aspirations and not necessarily consistent amongst different groups. But also then thinking about how this mapping informs relationships. How do we recognize existing networks, knowledge networks, which set their own agendas amongst different groups, communities in different regions of the world? How do we ensure that funders who are funded by ODA funds respond to this and draw these networks into their own strategic agenda setting processes, into their own prioritization or decision-making processes about allocation of research funds, whether that's through integration of a variety of knowledge actors into peer review colleges, or integration into of a variety of voices, perspectives into evaluation of research. So that's a key challenge. I also wanted to say something about impact and this big impact agenda, which Joanna touched on earlier as well. And I think there's an acknowledgement that we are not getting at the full spectrum of impact in our research. Again, going back to the paper, Tommaso and Ismael's paper, I think this focus on systems and this focus of impact not just being an add-on at the end, but really embedded in how research is framed from the start and who is involved in that research is really key. And that despite the focus on necessary focus on scientometrics, how can we get at these other indicators of research, of impact, through involvement of different actors in defining research priorities and participating in the research itself. And I think it would be interesting to hear more from a UKRI perspective about the decision to, recent decision to end the Pathways to Impact section of funding proposals, because this was an opportunity to think through some of these complex ideas of impact as a process, as a set of practices, as well as a set of outcomes that research aspires to. So that's a second thing. And I guess just going back to going back to the paper and thinking about both the contribution, this kind of contribution of systemic thinking to a very complex field, perhaps funders can learn from there's a whole variety of initiatives. For example, the Canadian International Development Research Centre's Research Quality Plus program, which is an attempt to integrate into an understanding of impact, an understanding of societal benefit, a more consciously value recognizing, context responsive means of evaluating research, involving a whole number of knowledge actors in this evaluation, not just academics, certainly not just academics from Canada and other countries in the global north. So how do we do that? How do we ensure that relationships are built and maintained between other research funders? UKRI has done some work with the African Academy of Sciences, like the Wellcome Trust. So how do we think about these relationships from the level of research governance through prioritization and decision making, all the way down to research implementation, communication, and then thinking about learning and use, not as a linear process or even a cycle, but as a complex array of processes within and practices within a system. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jude. Another wonderful complementary set of issues, really enriching our basis for discussion. Please do chip in, as I see some have begun to do in the chat box, to collect some points and questions together. And I think then an issue that follows on from what you said really eloquently there is that no matter how powerful the techniques and the tools and the visualization methods, in the end, this is an irreducible matter of politics. It's not just a technical matter. It is also, as you've emphasized in several ways, a political matter. And what do we do about that? And who better to ask at the hard end of the politics of research at the moment in really relaxing circumstances, I think, Paul Nightingale.
Thank you very much, Andy. I'm sure people have heard too much of me talking already today, so I'm only going to focus on one question, which is the second question, which is about understanding what alignment means. I like simple framework, so I'm going to present in a couple of minutes how I think about this and how I think it's changed. So if we go into kind of a three-stage model, I think the first stage was the model that I grew up with when I did my PhD, which was the alignment between research and societal need is something that just happens by magic. So kind of science produces knowledge, more knowledge is good, therefore more science is good. And if we fund science, because it's uncertain and we can't predict where the outcomes are, it will generate these fantastic outcomes. And there is a lot of evidence to show that research that was funded in that way did produce huge numbers of fantastic outcomes. But there are concerns about that, particularly as the amount of money that we spend on research has grown, that there's a lack of democratic oversight there. There's potential for lock-in. So sometimes areas of research, like rivers, will silt up. So they may be vibrant and interesting at some point, but over time, it may be that we've discovered everything that's there. And then the third thing, which I think is particularly important in relation to the paper that we've been celebrating today, is it gives you no framework to decide how to choose between different areas. So if you invest in one area, there will be an opportunity cost, and that is at the heart of decision-making about science policy, and probably the hardest thing that people like me have to deal with. So that was our first view. Our second view, I think, can be summarized under the title of the impact agenda, where I don't think there was anyone who was involved in this thought that there was this thing called societal need that was just out there as an independent thing that we could measure. But what they sought to do was try and find ways of engaging with research users and asking research users, what are the problems that are important to you? What types of research are most useful to you? And what's the format and the timing of that research that will be most valuable to you? And that kind of work has been very, very important in informing the UKRI response to COVID. So we have done an extensive process of engaging with the Science Advice Network, engaging very widely to find out what the important societal questions are around COVID. And when proposals come in for our urgency grant, we're turning for ESRC, we're turning the majority of them around in 10 days. So sometimes we're running 2 panels a week. And during that 10 days, we are taking the research that's coming in and we are matching it to key research questions and seeking advice from research users about the particular value of this research, which then informs the peer review process, which is independent, it's all done on excellence, and the governance is in place, but is informing and aligning research with societal need as best we can. Now, the problem with that approach is that it kind of assumes that there is this societal need that is just out there that we can articulate and match to. And one of the things that's obvious from my life is that I often don't know what I need. It's often something that I am perhaps ill-equipped to understand, and it's often something I discover from interacting with other people. We also know that there are very, very substantial biases in how people understand their needs. And this goes back to John Stuart Mill, and there's a huge literature on those biases. And then there's a basic issue about power. So the people that we will be talking to will not be representative of society by any stretch of the imagination. And that's just for the UK. The people outside the UK are completely excluded from this engagement, but they will experience the outcomes of this research and their voices won't be heard. So I'm very influenced by criticism of people like Adrian Smith at Sprue when he talks about history and saying that different kinds of history can open up different voices that can feed into that decision-making process. So if we move from that into a more nuanced understanding of what societal need is, it's not this thing that's out there. It's an outcome of a process of engagement, of reflection, of opening up debate, of explicitly addressing the dynamics at work, the processes, and who is not there, and are their voices heard and listened to. So one of the things that for many years as a science policy researcher, I was really struck by was the importance of the processes. So even when you have a really well-defined process and you engage extensively with a wide range of research users, sometimes the outcome of that process does not reflect that at all. But there's an old Russian saying that in a democracy, power doesn't go to the voter, power goes to the people who count the votes. So I think there's a need to look at the actual processes within organizations to make sure that they do deliver on that and they extend out, and we continually monitor and think about the realization of benefits. So benefits realization is a really key thing. So societal need isn't something that just happens naturally. Alignment doesn't just happen naturally. It's not this objective thing that we can go and measure. It's an evolving thing, and hence societal alignment between the research system and societal needs to be a process that is very critically reflected upon, both provision of evidence, which I think this paper really provides, but also critical perspectives that open up the process, and that we explicitly recognize that it is biased and it can improve. So there's my comments.
Well, thank you so much. Again, really nicely building on the earlier talks, with a little bit of personal agony in there as well, which was nice to hear about. But this realpolitik, if it is political, and you mentioned, Paul, I think a crucial word that I hadn't heard up till now, it would be interesting to hear people's reflections, the word democracy. What role, what does it mean? What might it mean in this context? And how to address it. But before we turn, and we're already getting some really very juicy comments and questions coming in, we have our final panelists, and thank you very much so far for a great set of issues. Paul Strout, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Andy. It's not easy to be the last speaker, because quite a number of good points have already been made. I'm a university professor, and my core business is to train would-be scientists or would-be researchers. So I try to help individuals to become independent researchers, and that process and its outcome are actually much more important than the topic of research itself, at least for my role in the process. Moreover, I use research to help undergraduates to develop academic skills. And in that respect, research is actually a tool for training. And that makes me a very independent person. I can actually focus on the long-term needs of society, especially in relation to capacity. And as a university professor, I can afford to think about research as a sort of educational and cultural activity to the benefit of society, and hopefully also to the democratization of science, helping the general public also to understand science. Society does need academically trained professionals, but perhaps I create too many scientists who know everything about nothing, and not the type that knows a little bit about everything, and especially is then capable of contextualizing that knowledge. And that last issue is a rare and a very much demanded skill. And perhaps universities should also rethink whether they actually really deliver what society really needs in terms of generalists and people who can contextualize knowledge. Yet I do need funding for my research, and therefore I also need to comply with the wishes and the demands of my funders and donors. Most of my funders use the concept of theories of change to force me as an applicant to really think about how my research could actually also serve them. But it only works for research with a short-term applied objective. And that's not the type of research I would like to do, and perhaps also not the type of research that society needs most. It is definitely selecting for a certain type of research. I also do a lot of research for private donors who simply have too much money and want to spend that on, for example, research, and usually provided funds without any further demands. The only thing they want is to see me excited about my work, and then I need to share that excitement, and that gives me a very special role because I not only need to create publications, but I also need to create that feeling of excitement about what science can bring to society, and that's my role towards that type of donors. And that brings me to the point of science and society. I'm very much worried about the image of science and the image of research. In general, there is too much interference by donors. There's too much path dependency. For example, at the moment, my university, Wageningen University and Research, is blamed for all the negative impacts of intensive agriculture in the Netherlands because of that path dependency. There are too many conflicting ideas and paradigms, and there are too many people saying that science only provides one of the many possible opinions, and there are too many politicians claiming that they don't need experts because they only need to listen to the voice of the people. So science and research have a very difficult position at the moment, and they need to defend that position. So there are also very important counter questions to be asked. For example, whose research, whose science, and whose societal needs? And that automatically brings me to the power relations that were already brought up by Paul and by Andy. And actually, I don't have the answers to that, which is a rather big frustration for myself, being in science for more than 40 years right now. But apparently, funders have developed their ideas about those power relations, but they're also very flexible in their ideas. I mean, they change ideas all the time. See, for example, the struggle that is already going on for decades between big donors and the CGR consortium. Alessandro was already referring to that. And that debate is going on, and there's a continuous struggle for expectations and the deliverables, etc. And I have the feeling that donor strategies change faster than research can progress. So we need a longer-term vision of our donors. For example, also in terms of research towards sustainability and all those sustainability development goals. So there we also see that the views are changing faster than the solutions that science can deliver. So impact assessment is important, but it should not be done with a short-term view in mind, otherwise it becomes useless. We should also not forget that the solutions of today are very often the problems of tomorrow, and that certainly applies also for agriculture. And that means it takes time, it takes research, and it takes reflection to acknowledge that. And that's also something that we need to tell our donors. They need to realize that there is inherent slowness of research. So I like to see researchers as knowledge brokers, as co-learners with, for example, farmers or technicians, but also with policymakers, as system developers who can probably be more effective in making use of the latest knowledge and insights, and certainly be playing a more important role than just producing high impact papers with impressive age indexes and etc. So there should be a different role for researchers next to writing wonderful publications. Knowledge broken is probably very important as well. I think I should leave it with that. Thank you.
Again, thank you very much, Paul. Some really crucial points there, and the idea of knowledge brokering in the middle, and also raising some uncomfortable issues, some tensions you brought to the fore here about diversity is not a free lunch, and what actually can be lost in this. I think that's an important thing to address in the discussion as well, since we've heard so many calls for it. So thank you so much, both Pauls and Joe and Alessandra and Jude, for a really excellent kickoff to our discussions, which we now have plenty of time to mull things over. The format we've chosen for this, rightly or wrongly, is, I'm sorry, it'll be me interpreting questions from the chat box, and I hope to be able to do that faithfully, but if I'm not, please put some exclamation marks on your chat to indicate to me if I've done you an injustice. But we've got some great points piling in, and I encourage more. Just to remind everyone, our focal flag in the landscape here, because we've painted a very complex landscape, the relation between research and societal needs. That's what we are discussing at centre stage. And the two strands of commentary and questioning that I've kind of picked up so far in quite a populated chat box are one on the implications then of the more political policy processes, which I'll outline three that are coming up there, and then one on techniques, more nitty-gritty. How can techniques, and of course they're not separate, how can techniques address that policy, and how can policy be more receptive to techniques? These are a joined challenge. So some of the great issues that have been arising then are, first of all, Maria Savona, whilst appreciating the calls for bottom-up and participatory work, also pointed out that we can't take it for granted that what we might call bottom-up, grounded, participatory research somehow is a get-out-of-jail-free card for these issues that especially Alessandra, well, in fact, all our speakers have variously alluded to, of discrimination, of privilege, of power. And so what can we do about bottom-up research to make it not itself be discriminatory in some new way? A crucial point, I think. Jakob Joneby, in a related issue, Jakob, I hope I've pronounced your surname correctly. How, given what we've said then about research processes, how should funders think about this balance, or dance maybe, between, and sometimes dances, as I know painfully, can be quite clumsy, between curiosity-driven and needs-driven research? What does it mean? We can easily talk about that balance, or what does it mean? Ed Steinmuller, in a related point then, asks whether we should be moving away in research funding from the fund and forget model towards a more integrated, maybe sustained involvement of funders in the planning and implementation and evaluation of research. So a series of steps there, looking at the research process and challenging some of the sort of apple pie terms that we have been using. And then on techniques, and I'll join these together because that's the way our discussion is going. No, I won't. I tell you what, I'll go to our panelists just for those three issues about the wider challenges, and we'll come back to some of the techniques in a moment. Who would please put your little yellow thumbs up sign among the panelists if you'd like to speak? Who'd like to start us off with any of those challenges? If I made sense of them. I don't know if to our panelists, we haven't checked this in advance. Do you know where to find the little yellow, the reactions button? There's a wavy hand. I think you could show me that. Oh, great. Alessandra, thank you.
Yes, I was addressing again the point that was emphasizing what I was also saying before about the fact that you can't take for granted that bottom-up is actually equal. I mean, gender biases are a product of our society. So you can't take for granted that communities on the ground will not be gender biased, because otherwise there wouldn't be gender discrimination in societies, right? So the way I try and approach this in terms of how do we move forward is that for me, I go very much on the ground and I try and assess gendered opportunity and constraints, for example. And then when I do my analysis, I bring in gender equality as a framework of our project. So for me, the starting point is we're not just, when we go in with a technical intervention, even with the genetics project, we do change relations. We do change the way people do things. And for that reason, we have to make sure that the impact of our project is gender responsive, gender equal. And then, so in that sense, I come up with the findings from the ground. I then try and adopt gender equality as a framework for the project, because our projects are, already gendered and they have a gendered impact the way they are designed. And then what I do, I bring it back to the community and I try and engage communities in finding a solution. So we talk with them, especially when we work on gender transformative approaches, we engage with the communities because we want to discuss with them what they think is appropriate, what their aspirations and needs are, again, in terms also of gender equality. So that's the practical way I try in my daily job to combine the bottom up and top down. I hope this makes sense.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much. Yes, absolutely. And no one is more aware of these kinds of paradoxes and tensions in participatory work than those actually right at the hard end in the way you've been for years. Thank you. Paul Nightingale.
Hi, yeah, I think the question about kind of apple pie solutions, how do you align research with societal needs? I think they are potentially dangerous and can be used to, rather than address biases, can be used to reinforce them. So I go back to the point I made about that it's very important to look at process. So I'll give you an example. Many years ago, I went to a sand pit where lots of academics spend 2 days talking about what's the important research questions that need to be addressed. And there were some research users in there as well. And then at the end of the session, we had to vote on what we thought were the most important research questions. And everyone was given lots of stars that they would put next to questions. And the idea was whoever had the most votes, they would be the prioritized questions. And there was a group of academics there whose discipline involved looking and understanding these sorts of issues. And what they did is they waited till the end and then went en masse and voted for the things that they were guaranteed to win on. So they managed to bias the process. And then when that went up for decisions to be made, the people making the decisions then decided that that wasn't the correct outcome of the process, and they did what they wanted to do anyway. So you've got multiple levels of bias and game playing working on, and we need to look at those processes and we need to make sure that they are improved and opened up. And we certainly shouldn't assume that, as with democracy, we need to take a constitutionalist approach, and just going out and asking people is not in any way sufficient guarantee we will get good outcomes. let alone the right outcome, whatever that might be.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you. And yeah, Jude, please.
Thanks. I'm not sure I meant to do that, but I will.
Too bad.
Is it just right? Yeah, just to follow on from Paul's point, I think that's really important. I think there's a difference between participation as representation and then involvement or identification of the different needs of different communities. And I think the notion, we focus quite a lot on participatory research, community-based research, understanding very localized issues, acknowledging localized expertise, but then the challenge is that how do you integrate that up into global spaces? I think that two sort of examples of learning from my work, firstly based on long-term relationships, so whether it's relationships between communities and local academic institutions or other research centres in specific contexts and specific places over many, many decades, building up those relationships, understanding the bias, the diversity of opinion, the changing, evolving needs. And then the question is, how do you scale that up into a kind of global space? And one example of where this has been done really well is the UNESCO Chair Platform in Community-Based Research and Social Responsibility in Higher Education. And they have a hub system of these very localized agenda setting hubs, which incorporate academics and community organizations, other practitioners across the global south and excluded north. Importantly, UK is part of the excluded north in one of these. And then they have a series of global events to scale up these local hubs and look at common global trends, response to kind of global crises. And it's quite interesting because it gives you a very different sense of the global. We all make assumptions about global basically being the SDGs with representation, or within UK policy, our specific global agendas with representation of different actors. But then when you look at existing global networks, which might completely exclude the global north, there are certain movements, for example, across South Asia, Latin America, and Sub-Saharan Africa, which create their own globals and alternative means of setting agendas and understanding global priorities against those local agendas. So I think it's about recognizing that there are different ways to do the global and different ways to do representation, as much as questioning our own practice. But I totally agree with what Paul said in terms of the problematic nature of apple pie statements in looking at all of this.
Thanks very much, Jude. And I think, I don't know if you would agree with the way I put it, but it follows from that great point you just made that in order to have balance of the kind we're calling for in different ways, you often need bias. It's where existing practices are unbalanced in the representation they give, then one needs deliberately in some way to bias to achieve a kind of end. And that's quite a challenge for a research community concerned always to perform, if not actually substantiate, a middle, neutral, independent position. But Joe, you've been waiting patiently to come back at some of these points.
Hi, yes, sorry, I just wasn't sure that I got the right hand up or the right thumbs up or whatever. I wanted to come back a bit on this, on the distinction that's often made between curiosity-driven and applied research, and maybe link it to Ed's question about is there a need for research funders to stay involved. First of all, I think about that distinction. There is another category which is often ignored, which is use-inspired research. And actually, if you look at use-inspired research, I think what you begin to see is that it's a set of skills and capabilities that are important, and that often sort of overcome that bridge between curiosity-driven and applied research. Often, some of the best researchers in the world, depending on how you measure it, achieve both. They are researchers who, like Bob Langer at MIT, or Stephen Hardy at UCL, whatever, you could name people, and lots of people in the field of development, international development, manage to achieve great research while being very focused. And I think that does come back to Ed's point, because I think partly what's needed to overcome that balance is not only a set of, of individual researchers who have adopted a certain outlook, but a framework in which they work, and having research funders sort of partnering and those encouraging a broad spectrum of other partnerships is really important in overcoming that distinction. So it's another approach, rather than just thinking about it in terms of percentage funding going to either of those categories. How do we create the kind of organizational and institutional mechanisms and techniques that help overcome that distinction creatively?
Yeah. Thank you, Joe. And great points again. I'd like to, it'd be interesting to understand also the implications of the importance of partnerships that you've just outlined, and brokering that Paul Strauch mentioned earlier. Paul, I haven't seen a hand from you, and that's very fine, because all the speakers do not have to address all the issues, but are you happy there? Come back in the next round, or have you got something in this round?
I'm happy to go back in the next round, yeah.
Yes, very good, very good. Okay, I just want to make sure that it wasn't because the functionality wasn't working. Well, great. Well, we have a whole series of other issues arising in the chat box, as far as I can see it. And I want now to privilege the more technical points about techniques that have been arising. In actual fact, we've been very nice to them, but it seems that both Tommaso and Ismael want to challenge us. The discussion. In fact, they're challenging each other again as well in the chat box. But also, I think some great challenges about, well, this is all very well, these kinds of high-blown normative and political issues we're addressing in the discussion so far, but what about how do methods address this? So Tommaso, for instance, asks, in practice, how can we map this kind of diversity that we're speaking of, the diversity of contexts, the diversity of pathways, and the diversity of perspectives and interests that are in play with every single pathway in every single context? How can we, in practice, do that? And of course, this paper is showing one way through, but it hasn't solved that problem yet. So Tommaso's challenge on that, and Ismael then, I think also in line with that, is addressing the nature of the research process. How can we move these kinds of activities, these appraisal, evaluative activities upstream? And of course, there we have this famous dilemma named after David Collingridge, which is, of course, as you move upstream, it becomes at least as easy to perform any kind of confidence in what the outcomes actually mean. So you have uncertainty coming to the fore there for everyone's view, no matter how committed they may be. But how do we then move upstream, and how do we reconcile, I'm adding here a bit to Ismael's point, but how do we reconcile that with the so-called Collingridge dilemma of the uncertainties growing as you go further upstream? I hope I've done justice to those points. There's other great points coming in, but panelists, would you like to respond to any of those methodological points, or indeed we can have other comments picking up in the audience as well? You don't all have to come in on every point. Anyone want to pick up those practical methodological points? Alessandra, thank you, please.
So I think the point about mapping the diversity of groups was in relation to what I had said before. Yes, indeed, this is one way of doing it. Just that the issue is that you may end up with a whole lot of groups. You may end up with the minority groups, with age groups, with gender groups, with crop or livestock species, or so you may end up with a whole lot of groups. And in a way, a research technology or innovation really needs to again decide which group are they listening to. And there is only, I do a lot of work with genetics. Before I worked with crops, and now I work with the livestock. And in the end, they will tell you, well, we need to produce a number of new varieties or a number of new breeds. It's not an infinite number. So again, the power of prioritizing, the power of deciding whose preferences gets prioritized comes back there. So you can map. Sometimes it's an interesting academic exercise, but when in the end you have to produce something, you again have to deal with the power who decides what gets prioritized.
Yes, thank you. Anyone else want to comment on these really thorny methods? I would add as well, thank you, on this methodological challenge then, I think it follows, but I may be wrong in this, from the discussion we had in the first round of discussion and then this methodological points, that the job of methods then is not simply it's not as if it's bad enough already, trying to document and illuminate and elucidate these diversities and complexities in the research environment, but it's also to catalyze the very forms of democracy that are lacking in the research process. So we can't just assume those forms of democracy are there. The methods themselves, the metrics, the visualization techniques have to somehow catalyze it, provoke it. And that's where, for the point of view of the STEPS work, that the idea of opening up comes from. That if we represent these issues in a closed way, then we allow these closure processes that are underway in research to just follow their own course. Whereas if we deliberately open up, it's uncomfortable, but we maybe help provoke accountabilities of the kind that are presently lacking. But others may have different thoughts.
Can I follow up on that?
Oh, please, yes, please.
Yes. I think you make a very good point in stressing diversity. We also need diversity in research. And at the moment, especially in the curiosity-driven research, there is a tendency to concentrate on the excellent teams. And that's only one route they follow. And moreover, they tend to concentrate on really on the frontiers of science. And they move those frontiers continuously. But they then create gaps of knowledge just behind the frontiers, which need to be followed up by very good teams who are not excellent. And it's very difficult for those very good teams to get the funding that the excellent teams are getting. Yes. So I would also like to see a sort of funding instrument, especially from public funding that is supporting curiosity-driven research, that is not only going to the excellent teams, but also to the very good teams. And I see that as a problem. And everybody in science knows who are the very good teams, who are the excellent teams, and who are the poor teams. It's not very difficult to make that distinction, as long as we also fund the researchers who simply fill up the gaps that the excellent teams are leaving behind.
Yeah, yeah. Great. Well, thank you. I see no more hands, but we've got a lot of things coming up from the chat box, and I want to cluster together now a few related points that I've come to my attention anyway, which is around the realities of the research environment. I'm picking several things the panelists said in the first discussion. So Constantine, for instance, reminds us of the immense institutional pressures at work here. Ed points out that funders lack democratic accountability, and so these immense institutional pressures are at work in ways we all know in our day-to-day lives, but cannot acknowledge in the actual content of our bids quite often, without risking prejudicing the very bids we're putting forward. That's me glossing on Ed and Constantine's point. But then also another point that relates to this, raised by Garth, is the increasing pervasiveness of new public management, this importation from the private sector into the public sector of tools that work in the context of a private sector environment, but maybe there are questions about how they work in the public sector, and then actually challenging that public-private distinction, Tommaso, Ciarli's point, that actually to what extent is the public sector actually public in this regard? For instance, one only has to look at the trends among universities in the UK to see the increasing hegemonic role of private sector practices, as well as values and priorities. And then Hugo asked a question, again related to that point, about the role of philanthropic funders coming out of the private sector with very strong agendas like the Gates Foundation he mentions, but to what extent are these new range of crucial institutions coming out of the private sector, where private sector practices and cultures actually able to escape these dilemmas that we see also in the public sector. So there's a cluster of issues there challenging notions of public-private, notions of philanthropy, notions of accountability inside research systems, even as they are, let alone without new public management taking over. So who's provoked or inspired by those kinds of points from our audience? Or completely bamboozled by my garbling of what were initially very clear points. But anyone like to come in on those issues? I mean, my own, for what it's worth, my own take is, I tried to make the point earlier about not looking under the lamppost. That the kinds of practices we take for granted, the way we perform our disciplinary identities, the way we, no matter how well motivated and socially minded we are, we have to pay attention to career advancement, especially as young researchers now. And we have to perform in incredibly compliant ways in order to do that. And so looking under the lamppost isn't just an idle thing that we find ourselves doing as a foible. It's something that's imposed very strongly on us by these evaluative techniques, these new public management techniques, and the idea that the public sector research is somehow independent of private priorities. So these things, in my experience, bite very deeply in our lives as researchers. So how can we address that? Otherwise, I'll come back to the questions themselves. I see Tommaso looking very relaxed, and I am tempted to ask him. But no, Paul, please.
So I think these are a very, very important set of very deep questions. Weber, in kind of politics as a vocation, he made a distinction between practicality and purity, and there is a danger that we go to either extreme. And where we are on that kind of ideal type continuum, I think is partly a matter of things that are forced on us, but we do have a small degree of influence on that. I mean, my personal view may be more towards the practical rather than the pure, and I accept that as a consequence of that, I'm going to need people to kind of criticize what I do. On that practical element, then I think we need to be avoid being overly pure and be realistic about what these types of arguments are likely to lead to in practice. Democratizing science does not necessarily lead to outcomes that people like me may like. And if I'm honest about democratizing science, I have to accept that. I have to accept that my own political views may be very, very different from the rest of society, and the outcomes that are reached may be very, very different from the views of people who are on the purer end. So, in all of this, I think we need to be realistic about what opening up means. So the obvious example would be if we are going to open up decisions about science to different actors in society, it may well be that industry has a much larger voice. And that is something that, that we need to be realistic about and consider that there will be pros and cons of that. So being kind of pushing a bit of a kind of controversial kind of point here, which I'm sure Andy will come back on. I think there is that Weberian balance between purity and practicality that we need to be honest about.
Thanks, Paul. I think colleagues will have noted you did actually invite our strategy director of ESRC that we make your life difficult.
And I'm very pleased to say that you make my life difficult every single day I come to Sprue.
Well, yeah, on that note, so just to make sure you really did say what you said, you did say that by opening up, we may actually have to address the fact that industry and business their agendas are too neglected in research at the moment.
I'm not sure I said that. I think the paper here shows very clearly that they have a very, very powerful voice, and that there are other voices which are just as valid and are neglected. But if we are going to be talking about opening up decision making about science, we do need to consider that there will be lots and lots of other voices in there, and that we need to not have a kind of overly pure view and be realistic about exactly the issues that are highlighted in this paper.
Great. Yeah, thank you. We're all coming towards the end of what I think is an extremely interesting discussion. Will the chat box be made available to people after the discussion, can I ask? Because that has a...
Yes, it's being recorded. Great. It will be transcribed.
Great, so recording and chat box. So there's a lot of really rich things I haven't been able to do full justice to going on, some very interesting exchanges going on in the chat box. We're gonna have the panelists will have a chance to wind up. So please think about what you might like to say for 2 or 3 minutes at the end for 15 minutes. So this is a last chance for people to come in before that with any final observations or questions. But sorry to spring this on you. I did slightly warn you, Tommaso and Ismael, as our focus of attention here, because you've been very restrained in a way, apart from arguing with each other. I'd like to, if you've got any reflections on these challenges that come from your work that you'd like to chip in before the end. And I invite other colleagues also, please come into the chat box. Please, Tommaso or Ismael.
So on my side, I think the reflection would be that, well, we have been talking about how priority setting should be. We have been discussing less how priorities are de facto made by existing funding sources. Like I was mentioning in the chat, the issue of how the close alignment between pharma and biomedical research, or by visions of the world that natural scientists might have about what is relevant research. But even if it's curiosity driven, there might be curiosity about different ways, and they happen to be interested in genes rather than many more researchers seem to be interested in genes rather than ecological webs. And so part of the agenda is not thinking only how to manage priority setting, but realizing how priorities get made in the existing political economy and being critical about that. And I think we might not have discussed enough of this.
Yes. And that is a point about, I think there's a word for that, but you get in big trouble, even in Sprue, for using that word reflexivity. I still get in trouble, not least from Paul. And it's interesting how some of the words that are most useful in addressing these challenges very close to home are actually the most deprecated among ourselves in some disciplines. And we need to reflect on that too, I think. Tommaso.
Thanks, Andy. So I think this was an extremely rich discussion. I think I have three main points just to highlight. The first one is about coordination. The second one is about incentives, and the third one is about distribution. They're all related. So in my point that I was raising to Alessandra, and I think this debate about the relation between bottom-up and inequality and how difficult it is to address all the needs. And being balanced about that. I was thinking also about what Ugo was saying in terms of the concentration of power in the public sector, which is more the philanthropic sector in few organizations, and how we might need some coordination at the public level. There's been some discussion in the chat box that Andy was highlighting about what do we mean by public sector? It's very difficult to understand what we mean by public sector. If I think about, so I came to Sprue from the Max Planck Institute in Germany, Vienna, and if you think about when I asked to bring money to the Max Planck Institute to apply for projects, they look at me very strangely. They say, why would you need to do that? We give you all the resources because we don't want you to be dependent on any external funding. So this is you have the installment, you can do whatever you want. Just think about the research that you need to do, and this is paid for, and it is a public research, and it is and this allows you to have very different incentives from the one that you need to have in an organization in the UK, but also in ILRI, and how do we try to coordinate from a public good perspective all this research, knowing that there is a private sector that have their own incentives, but at the other hand, there must be a public sector which sort of rebalance what the private sector prioritize, as Ismael was saying. So how do we guarantee that there is this imbalance? And I think as Konstantin is raising, there is so much pressure here in those institutions that it's almost impossible to do research which is relevant. So this is about the incentives and what people have been already raising. Researchers care about their careers, and universities care about the ref and how they need to perform. So the third point is about distribution. How do we make sure that we redistribute that every year? At the end of the year, we say, okay, so because of the incentive structure, because of the lack of coordination, because the crucial importance that philanthropic funding has or private sector has, we haven't prioritized lots of issues which are extremely crucial. So can we now rebalance that? So do we need a public sector having this role of coordination and understanding what has not been done, and chip in and redirect, and how we say steer the research in a direction which is more useful?
Yes, yes. Thank you. And on that point, actually, Tommaso, I see in the chat box that Ed's raised a point, he's discussing it with Garth at the moment, around these pressures that Konstantin introduced, these massive pressures that you just were alluding to inside the research system. Actually, those institutions and actors who, for us, like Paul, are immensely powerful in the system, themselves are really small fry, sorry, Paul, in relation to the wider forces beyond. And so what can we do about that? Let's remind ourselves that we're only addressing some sort of fractal, tiny manifestations of the power that drives research and innovation in the direction it goes in the work we do. And of course, the more seriously we take a grounded research, the more true that is. So that's a point which can be maybe folded into what panelists would like to address at the end. And on that point, I'd just like to make a very quick bullet point that, does this mean then that researchers need to think about mobilizing themselves politically? That won't, of course, be a single movement, because there is such a diversity in research, but researchers are so keen to keep this emperor's clothing of neutrality about themselves, which all know to be somewhat romantic. But this issue that even the research process is itself not disinterested, maybe there's something we can do more to highlight in a way that this discussion has done, that it's possible to be a really sincere researcher as well as having commitments, and we can talk about those between different commitments. And maybe that's something that's lacking that helps to address these wider forces. Showing these issues are political, and we can discuss them across these political divides. But that's just a question, maybe missing a point. I don't see, apart from a reference to a science party, which wasn't quite what I meant. I'm going to come back, Paul, to the whole panel, and let's go in reverse order this time for the winding up. So that would be Paul Strauch first, and then Paul Nightingale, and then back the way we came, if that's okay with colleagues, with Joe, the grand finale. So please, Paul Strauch.
Okay, thank you very much, Andy. I would like to make 5 connected points. First of all, I think that researchers should be worried about their license to do research. We are spending a lot of money, and we need to deliver something in return for that. And it's not automatic that that will be kept funded. So we need to think about a strategy to really maintain that license. And secondly, I think that we also need to rethink a little bit about the role of research, and especially the role of researchers. Perhaps that is a too static approach that we are currently doing. Knowledge broker, that's a term I already mentioned before. I think we need to make that role of the researcher much more dynamic than we are currently doing. And that automatically links to the third point, and that is the public relations of science. Our PR is not very good. And science is part of a worldview, but a worldview also affects our science. I mean, that's an interaction. And I think that we should be very honest about that. But I also think that we should communicate that much more. For example, and that's the fourth point, in the role of science in all kinds of societal debates. For example, towards sustainability. Why don't we make use of our knowledge to also try to contribute to that debate, not making political decisions, but making sure that political decisions are being made in a way that all the knowledge that is available is also used. And for that, we need to play a role in that in that societal debate in a scientific manner. And third, the fifth point, the last point, is that I think that we should train our donors to think in long-term solutions for the problems of tomorrow instead of the short-term solutions to problems of today, to make sure that there is a better match between the time horizons of doing research and the societal needs that are served with those research activities.
Thank you. That's great. That's perfect. Thank you. And I think we should. I think the record of this meeting will bear some scrutiny, actually, as a source of really quite interesting insights into what might be done quite practically. But we can come to that. Paul Nightingale.
Yeah, I kind of. I'm not on mute. I'd come back to your kind of question about the kind of the politics of this. So, I mean, there is obviously a long tradition of academics who have taken very strong political views. So Bertrand Russell on nuclear disarmament, feminist scholarship has been, extremely important in all sorts of areas. Spru's own Julian Perry Robinson, who recently died, spent his entire life trying to rid the world of the evils of biological and chemical weapons. So there is a very, very legitimate role for academics who have a unique position in society to do that. I think when trying to influence policy, we need to make a distinction between that sort of activity and the kind of the Roger Pilkey kind of honest broker. And there, I think it comes back to your point about we need to be reflexive. And I know every week I give you grief about being reflexive, but all of us need to be reflexive, especially people like me who are critical of people who are reflexive. And we need to be thinking about the uncertainties of the arguments we're putting forward, the evidence for it, the potential biases we have, and be honest about, as a consequence of that, opening up decision making for, opening up access to influence for people who may not be part of people like myself's kind of very, very privileged and atypical position, and then give that kind of that clarity of evidence, but also be clear about the uncertainties and ethical implications of political decisions, and respect the difficulty of people who have to make those decisions under conditions of uncertainty, and all of us collectively think about the quality of the processes and the influence they can have on the effectiveness of how decisions are made and influenced. So I'm a bit of a liberal Roger Pilkey honest broker sort of argument here.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for that gracious display of a science and technology studies scholars like, I guess, myself, bang on about reflexivity, but actually achieve it in some ways less than the people who don't like the word. So there's a conundrum for us to ponder on. Thank you, Paul. Jude, would you like to say some concluding words?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks everybody for the questions and discussion. I guess I'd like to conclude by thinking a bit about this question of opening up science to diverse groups, to industry, to different knowledge actors, and thinking about whether that should be a goal, or rather we should be thinking about relocating science within a global knowledge ecosystem and thinking about what other types of knowledge science systems exist, whether that's indigenous knowledge science systems, or research funded by industry, or civil society funded, implemented research science, often quite with sophisticated quality assurance mechanisms, ethical procedures to rival our own academic processes and procedures. So for me, the question is, how do these different systems work together? How do they compete? What are the tensions within? How can we learn within academia from some of these different systems? What sort of moves are being made through things like scientometrics and other globalizing artifacts to enroll these different systems together, and what types of exclusions and inclusions will result from those kind of moves? So thinking about this broader ecosystem about the difference within that, about our role, but not necessarily assuming that we as academic scientists have to enroll this difference within our own system, because there are and always have been other systems outside our own. So just to end on this notion of the knowledge broker as well, I mean, I think increasingly academics are being expected to perform that role within their own research, within their own institutions, but there are knowledge actors outside of academia who have been performing this role in a much grander scale, interacting with governments, with industry, with civil society, with communities, and have that expertise and long-term knowledge. So perhaps we need to think, rather than trying to assume all the responsibilities ourselves, how can we better work with these types of existing brokers, these existing actors, acknowledge that capacity maybe is already happening outside, and we don't have to be the ones who take it upon ourselves to do everything. So I guess I'll end there. Thanks.
No, thank you, Ju. That's great. And just a reminder that the type of rigor that is indeed crucial, that's generated inside hierarchical disciplinary structures, is only one kind, and outside those, in the more agonistic, conflict-ridden world of politics more widely, there's another kind of rigor. It really is unforgiving environment, and you can't easily get things wrong there without suffering even worse than you do within a discipline. So thanks for that reminder. Alessandra.
Yes, I wanted to refer again to this idea of knowledge broker, and in relation to this two opposites in a way. We have been talking about the more impact applied kind of research versus the more abstract blue sky type of research, and also referring to the fact that there's been a mention of philanthropic funding. So I very much appreciate, and I work in the field of research for development. So this research that has an impact, and I do believe in the role of research with an impact on, the most marginal communities in society, especially when we use public money. But I do think that there is sometimes a problem. Sometimes we have private funders who focus very much on research for impact because they believe in the role of research and they want to see the impact on the ground. But then for impact to happen, sometimes I think there is a push for shortcuts. So in the case of the work that I do, I work on gender issues. I think gender issues and dynamics is a very complex world. And sometimes I have the push from funders to just work on women. There is this shortcut, gender issues, women. And I think that creates a lot of trouble and very often actually leads us to the wrong solutions that we find. So basically what I'm trying to say is we need to, I think, understand better is what the role is in this research for development in terms of highlighting the complexities, unveiling the complexities on the ground, and how the complexities of the research can then be actually helpful for impact.
Great, thank you. And as we know, these gender issues are not just out there in the world, they're in there even more intensely sometimes in the world of research evaluation and research scholarship itself. And of course there are other, some of the most invisible but powerful forces are cultural, like gender prejudice, racial prejudice, and class prejudice as well, which have very real implications for, I think, societal needs representations. Thank you very much, Alessandra. Jo Chataway.
What a great discussion, and I agree with so much of what's been said by other panelists, particularly about the importance of thinking constructively, critically about knowledge brokerage. We haven't talked much about COVID-19, so let me finish just by doing that. I think we have learned a lot about knowledge brokers and knowledge brokerers in the COVID-19 crisis. We have also learned that knowledge brokerage isn't enough. We need to focus on knowledge integration as well. And that's a different thing, and it harks back to some of what Jude was saying, I think, that our kind of expertise that we have in the world of research, in the world of universities and research institutes is only one kind. And there's knowledge which is derived from multiple sources, and we really need to understand how to bring together that knowledge and integrate different types of knowledge and data sets. Yes, so that seems to me to be a key part of the alignment challenge, actually, being able to respect the different types of knowledge which is created in different institutions and get much better at thinking about how to integrate our research knowledge with that knowledge for impact and use.
Yes. Great, thank you. That's a great. Thank you for bringing us back to these momentous times that we're actually having this discussion in. And I don't know, Joe. I mean, one of the struggles in the Strings project that you're co-directing, and Tommaso is is in the middle of, looking at steering innovation for global goals, is that challenge of integration. And one of the dilemmas there is that yes, diversity is important, but then the importance of it is often in the messiness, in the irreconcilable loose ends that come from engaging with diversity. So integration in the minds of the kinds of institutions that we're talking about in research and governance of science are often assume that integration means coming out with one single answer. And so that's one thing we're struggling with, I think, isn't it, in practice in that project. And it reminds then of this tension which we heard between the brokering role of researchers and also the committed pioneering role that is often fulfilled. And nowhere has, I think that thing has played out in this discussion fantastically. I mean, it's been a privilege working in SPRU for so many years myself, where we're constantly arguing about some of the deepest, not only disciplinary, but political matters, and long may that continue, but also in this wider discussion in the world of research scholarship, that's clearly alive and well. I just encourage colleagues, nowhere is this represented better than the name of Julian Perry Robertson, actually, who sadly departed recently. And I think that is an example we can look at. They are not mutually exclusive, as Paul mentioned, and there are ways in which the whole community can at the same time respect this vibrant diversity and also speak clearly with a voice that highlights that and the other issues that nowhere are more clear than now in the light of the experience of the pandemic, when probably everything will change, but not in ways that we yet know about. So, we have come to the end of the discussion. I want to thank everybody, panelists, all the people involved in the award ceremony. Paul has done an excellent job of thanking everyone associated with this event earlier on, but it's been a remarkable opportunity. Thank you to everyone involved in making this possible, for allowing us to have this platform and to convey it out to other people and to explore these open-ended issues where nothing has been solved, but a lot of very interesting possibilities have opened up. And I just want to say thank you also to everyone who's participated today for helping enrich our discussion. So yes, I think a little yellow hand is called for. I'm going to put mine up. I hope everyone had a good time. I wish everybody well and look forward to a chance to actually have an actual fight for the biscuits at the next gathering when we come together. Cheerio.
Thank you, Andy. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, all.
Thanks, everybody. Cheers.
Congratulations, guys.
Thanks, Paul. Bye, Ismael.